But next up, we are going to hear from Stephen Sander. He's a representative of the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. And so I want to pass it on over to Steve.
Great. Thanks so much, Shamir. Good evening, everyone. And a revolutionary good morning to all the people tuning in from Palestine who might be watching our webinar today. California to Palestine, free the land, free the people. Thanks everybody for tuning in. As Jamir said, my name's Steve and I'm an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Friends, comrades in the struggle, we're gathered in this virtual space to discuss how to free the land and free the Palestinian people who are being oppressed by this illegal Israeli occupation. And as we gather to celebrate Earth Day, I want to call attention to the environmental consequences that are causing the Palestinian people to suffer tremendously as a direct result of the Israeli occupation of the region. As an environmental scientist, let me say this as unequivocally as I can. The Palestinian people have played almost no role in contributing to the problem of human-induced climate change. It is the Western powers and the 100 biggest companies that have contributed almost exclusively to the problem of climate change. That means that Western powers have an obligation to protect countries like Palestine from the ill effects that climate change will cause in places like the West Bank and Gaza. And if the world is to get off of fossil fuels, then countries like Palestine need to be given the tools by already developed countries to grow their economy and their society in a carbon-free way. The fact that they have not done so and continue not to is something that causes me to feel a great sense of shame and anger. And it means that we need to call out these blatant injustices. They must be acknowledged, and that's why we're calling on the United States to remove its opposition to the International Criminal Court, looking into the human rights abuses perpetrated during the Gaza wars. So let me discuss some of these injustices, which are truly crimes against humanity and crimes against nature. And it is for this reason that we must have freedom for these people and for the land they're on. Freedom from this tyrannical oppression by these maniacs. They are necrophiles who actually want the Palestinian people to suffer. So we must free the land from occupation from this entity, and by freeing the land, we will free the people. And in order to free the land, we must free the people, and paradoxically, at the same time, we have to free the people to free the land, as you've heard from my colleague briefly. So indeed, as I transition to this next topic in my prepared remarks, I want to acknowledge the fact that I too occupy land that was stolen, and there has to be a process of accountability and reparations for that, for reparations for those whom this land was stolen, in this case, the Nisenan and Patwin indigenous people of the Americas. So I want to highlight a crucial aspect of this injustice taking place, and that is this apartheid state of Israel. It's a violation of human rights in so many ways. Israel continues to inflict environmental devastation in the occupied Palestinian territories. This has gone on for far too long, and it only seems to be getting worse. And make no mistake about it when I say apartheid. It is a two-tiered system of justice, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians and everybody else. So as you might have heard just this week, Human Rights Watch released a report on the matter, and the conclusions they come to at this point are simply irrefutable. So according to the report, quote, Israelis authorities maintain a two-tier system in which privileges Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. This means used by Israelis in the occupied is in the occupied territory amount to the systematic oppression needed to establish the crime of apartheid. Israeli authorities have committed a range of abuses against Palestinians. In the occupied territory, those abuses include mass land confiscation, the denial of residency rights, and the suspension of civil rights, and rise to the threshold of inhumane acts and severe abuses of the fundamental rights of Palestinians, end quote. Additionally, The Nation magazine reports that Israeli apartheid policies extend even to the issue of COVID vaccines as well. So Yara M. Asi writes in a piece published this past Tuesday, quote, while Israel has vaccinated more than 60% of its population, giving it the highest COVID-19 vaccination rate in the world, and while it is slated to have millions of excess vaccines, it has refused to supply shots to most Palestinians in the occupied territories, with the exception of those with Israeli work permits. Just about 5% of the Palestinian population has been vaccinated despite skyrocketing infection and mortality rates. Israel has received global condemnation for its unwillingness to vaccinate the 5 million Palestinians living in the occupied territories. As the occupying power, it retains responsibility for Palestinian health, even in the Oslo Accords, which do not supersede Israel's obligations, mandate that the two sides work together in cases of infectious disease, end quote. So Gaza Strip is indeed the world's largest open air prison, and Israel plays gatekeeper, preventing necessary supplies from entering and preventing people from coming and going as they wish. They prevent Palestinians from fishing in their own coastal waters. They prevent construction supplies and medical equipment from entering. They deny humanitarian assistance to the area even during a global pandemic. They have expressed nothing but ill intent towards the Palestinians living in that area, with Israeli leaders calling for them to be, quote, put on a diet, basically starved and deprived of resources until they acquiesce to Israel's demands. And the UN has said that Gaza would become unlivable by 2020, and it is only to the resilience of the Palestinian people that they continue to survive in these abhorrent conditions. You know, these apartheid policies are rooted in racism. As a person of Jewish descent, I could say that they are doing many of the same things that Nazi Germany did to the Jewish people. So we cannot allow this. We must not tolerate this kind of oppression and abuse to be perpetrated by an entity that we claim to be close allies with. And Nelson Mandela has called apartheid a crime against humanity. And in a speech to the UK House of Commons, Madiba noted, quote, racism is a blight on the human conscience. The idea that any people can be inferior to one another to the point where those who consider themselves superior define and treat the rest as subhuman denies the humanity even of those who elevate themselves to the status of gods. Indeed, racism is something that must be categorically rejected on its face whenever it appears. Rejecting racism is something that must be foundational to a society that claims to treat everyone equally and with dignity and respect. And Professor Albert Memmi, in his seminal text, Racism, writes, quote, the choice to conduct oneself morally is the condition for the establishment of a human order for which racism is the very negation. One cannot found a moral order, let alone a legislative order, on racism, because racism signifies the exclusion of the other and his or her subjection to violence and domination. And the refusal of racism is the condition for all theoretical and practical morality, because in the end, the ethical choice commands the political choice. A just society must be a society accepted by all. If this contractual principle is not accepted, then only conflict, violence, and destruction will be our lot. If it is accepted, we can someday hope to live in peace, end quote. I'll go one step further. The famed Brazilian author and scholar activist Paulo Freire has written about the behavior of these individuals who oppress, and he appropriately labels it necrophily, or the love of death. And Freire notes, quote, oppression, overwhelming control is necrophilic. It is nourished by love of death, not life. It attempts to control thinking and action, leads women and men to adjust to the world, and inhibits their creative power. Is that not what Israel is doing at this moment? So at this point, is there any really substantial doubt that this is an apt characterization? So I would like to say a few words now about water and about olives, because these are two critically important areas that are under assault by Israel. First, I need to point out that olive groves in the occupied Palestinian territories are under assault from the dual threats of climate change and Israeli settlers. This is exacerbated by Israel's restriction and mismanagement of the water. Settlers are attacking Palestinian farmers who are just trying to access their land to harvest their olives and burning their trees. Settlers are bulldozing olive groves and doing things like building roads over them. However, the people are fighting back, and there have been several contingents of volunteers who come in every year, both from within Palestine and also from outside the country, who help the Palestinian people fend off attacks by the Israeli settlers and the various security forces, and try to put themselves between the assailants and those who are simply trying to harvest olives from their own lands and their own olive groves. And olive production is, of course, cyclical and variable over the years in the West Bank, but several climate change impacts have hindered production in recent years. For instance, last May, a heat wave damaged much of the olive production, and the average rainfall amounts have fallen, and the rainy season has been shortened in its overall duration. There will be several bouts of drought, followed by episodes of very intense rain, so it's not possible for the ground to soak it up all at once. And there are other consequences like flooding that could result from that. But it shouldn't take you the UN to tell you that the olive groves and these olive productions has a cultural significance for the Palestinian people, and it provides them with a much needed source of income. Research shows that olives have been cultivated as early as 8,000 years ago. However, for the tens of thousands of people who rely upon olives for their source of income, this is yet another abuse that they have had to suffer while under occupation. And the destruction of these olive groves is, in my view, an affront to humanity. So when it comes to the issue of water more broadly, it's estimated that 97% of the water in Gaza, unfortunately, is undrinkable. And according to research by Ibrahim Faris and Yasmin Mansour, quote, since the 67 occupation of the Palestinian territories, Israel has controlled shared water in the region, including both the surface and groundwater. Israel has been utilizing more than 85% of these resources, leaving only 15% for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Such control has deprived the Palestinian Authority of accessing an equitable and reasonable share of transboundary shared water and natural resources. The shortage of water and the Israeli restrictions on access to clean water are becoming more disastrous for the approximately 4 million Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, end quote. So it's imperative that all people have access to clean water as a human right, and that the water resources in the region be shared in an equitable manner with the Palestinian people. So, comrades and friends, with all this in mind, of course, it's natural to feel a bit discouraged, maybe, with all of the ways that the Palestinians are experiencing this oppression. However, I would like to offer some ways that you might be able to help in the struggle, and feel free to, um, do one or none or all, however you feel, of course. First and foremost, I would say listen and signal boost the appeals of the Palestinian people themselves. Let us avoid speaking for them and instead use our power and our privilege to uplift their desires and their stories. Um, Another example, support and engage in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or BDS, against Israel. Many of the tactics that were successful in overthrowing apartheid in South Africa could be employed successfully in this instance. Next, you can urge your congressional representatives to co-sponsor legislation that ends or scales back US support militarily for Israel. Don't continue voting for pro-Israel representatives who don't support your views simply because they're the lesser of two evils. Um, at some point, they have to be shown that there are political ramifications for playing patty cakes with a state that supports and is upholding an apartheid system. You can support groups calling for the US to stop opposing the ICC from looking into war crimes committed during the 2014 Gaza war, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, get involved locally. Groups like the Answer Coalition, Sacramento Area Peace Action, the Strategic Release Campaign, the Sacramento Regional Committee for Palestinian Human Rights. Those are all examples of groups involved here in Sacramento, where I'm speaking to you from. So, with all of that in mind, comrades and friends, thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much for your attention to this really critically important issue. We have to draw this nexus, and we must free the land and free the people if we are to create a sustainable future for all. We say, attack one of us, you attack us all. So we need to be involved in the fight back. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to Jameer.